So welcome to this evening session. Ayaan, before we talk of anything else, when should we expect to see the baby infidel?
Before I answer that question, may I please just say what an honor it is to meet you and how much I enjoy. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Before I answer that question, I just wanted to say what an honor it is to meet you.
Oh, thank you.
And how much I enjoy being heckled. And also what a great honor it is to be here with the Simon Wiesenthal Center. Believe it or not, baby infidel is due on Christmas Day.
Wow! now that cannot be a Jewish conspiracy.
It must be.
My goodness.
It must be. I have one of my friends who said, for someone who's such a vocal atheist, it serves you right.
And is it a boy or a girl?
Well, due to modern technology, we know it's a boy. He's a boy. And I went to the doctor yesterday, and everything is fine. And I'm happy and grateful to
Ayaan, I'll start first with why I heckled you. See, I followed you. My family lives in Hoofddorp in Netherlands, and we're great admirers of you. And you were with the Labour Party over there. And when I realized you were the American Enterprise Institute, I asked that question, why? And a number of people thought I was being hostile, so I was dragged away. This was at the UFT seminar in that big hall. And they thought I was there because I was upset at your film, which was not the question. My difference was, as a Labour Party supporter, why did you switch to the right wing? But I'm now being accused of being more right wing than you, so I guess we're in the same boat. Now, you were the American Enterprise Institute. Do you receive any support from Muslim organizations or Muslims who have not renounced their faith?
I receive support from individual Muslims, like Zuhdi Jasser. I don't know if you're familiar with him in the US, but he's a Tariq Fatah, the Tariq Fatah of the US. He is a believing Muslim, a practicing Muslim. Yes. But he's one of those unique individuals who say, I am not going to endorse any harmful practices, intolerance, hatred toward Jews, and hatred toward my own country, which is the US for him, in the name of Islam. I simply refuse to do that. And like you, he has had to take threats and expulsions and so on. And so there are individuals like Zuhdi. You are all familiar with the Canadian woman Irshad Manji.
Irshad, yes.
There are more and more individual Muslims, not as many as I'd like to see, but individuals who stand out and who refuse to.
There's one gentleman from Somalia, Abdurrazak Behi, in Minneapolis, whose nephew was kidnapped and sent to Somalia, where he died, and who is a thorn in the side of Congressman, what's his name? Keith Ellison, a very dangerous man, I would suggest. But Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, by the way, if people don't know, is a retired lieutenant commander in the US Navy, and is head of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy in Phoenix, Arizona, and is the first man to come up and declare support for the Michigan state law that bars Sharia law from entering in that.
Yeah.
Coming back to your role in the United States as an outspoken critic of Islam, have you seen any progress? Have you seen something come out of your work in highlighting the oppressive nature of what I would call Islamism, but generally people associate with Islam?
Well, on a small scale, people who write to me after they read, Muslims write to me after they read Infidel or Nomad, they write to the AHA Foundation. And these are very personal, very emotional letters that say, even though I come from Pakistan or Afghanistan or an Arab country, or I was born here, I find myself reaching the same conclusions that you've reached about Islam, and particularly the treatment of women. And I don't want to offend my parents. I don't want to be expelled from my community. I don't want to become a pariah. But I have these problems. And they share their emotions with me. Some ask for help. Some have become ex-Muslims, and they try and preach to me, as I report in Nomad, saying, well, I don't want to live with the Muslim God, but I cannot live godless. And so they become Christians, and they try and convert me to Christianity. So there is a very interesting mix, and there is a lot of hope out there, but there is no well-organized, concerted effort to reach out to Muslims in general in the same way that the Saudi projects and the Salafi projects are done, which are blanket propaganda organizations that try and convince all Muslims that the Salafi Wahhabi view of Islam is the best view. But you have these, scattered, I consider them to be gems or diamonds all over the place. And I think the next step is, how do we bring those people together, create a common narrative that you can be a Muslim if you choose to, and still reconcile yourself with the ideals of freedom and tolerance that, frankly, have brought so many Muslims to the West from their own countries.
It's funny you mentioned something about Muslims converting to Christianity, and in one of your lectures you suggested that that might be a recipe. Why did you suggest Christianity? Why not Judaism? Why not, for me, Sikhism would be closer to my faith.
Yeah.
But Judaism is literally, Islam is Judaism implanted on Arab pagan culture. So it
Yes.
wouldn't that be a better suggestion?
Well, I considered Judaism, and the only problem is that to become a Jew is probably one of the most difficult processes in the world.
Is it? Wow.
Well, Jews don't proselytize. It's not...
But look what happened. They didn't do it, and they're still 15 million. Had they done what we had suggested they do,
Yes.
you too would have 22 countries.
Yeah. So I personally, I think also in terms of demography, that it is a wasted opportunity of the last 2,000 and some years that the Jews have decided not to become, the Jewish religion is not a religion that is spread. Maybe circumstances will change that. It's also a very smart religion. You have to be almost a PhD graduate to get into it.
Now that's one of the stereotypes.
Well, it is.
I've seen some very poor Jews as well in
There's an
Israel.
element of truth sometimes in stereotypes. To become a Muslim, all you have to do is Ashhadu an la ilaha, say Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammad. I declare that Allah is one and Muhammad is his prophet, and you're a Muslim.
That's easy, isn't it?
Entry is easy. Now try and get out. But with Judaism, you've got to pass all these tests. You've got to read all this. I mean, it's really not the easiest religion.
We'll have this conversation some other time.
Yeah.
But in the Muslim communities that you met in the United States, do you find a difference in how the Turk or the Iranian approaches you as compared to the Pakistanis, who seem to be the most vocal and rabid jihadis, not even more than the Palestinians would about Palestine? Where do you see these various communities? Because we never hear of Iranians as Muslim, or Turks as Muslims, or Kosovars as Muslim.
Well, I think first the Iranian experience. Iran is the only country on the planet that voluntarily accepted Sharia law in 1979.
It didn't voluntarily. It was forced.
Okay, but it's in Saudi Arabia. Saudis who are against Sharia will argue that their circumstances were different. Somalis will argue their circumstances are different, but Iranians were, first of all, they come from, they're a former empire in their own right before Islam. It's a very sophisticated country with a very long history. It was one of the most westernized, modernized Muslim countries. And in 1979, they rejected a corrupt government, as Egypt is doing today. And in choosing between what was in display in terms of ideologies and ideas about how to furnish a state and a government, they seemed to go with Khomeini. They picked Sharia law. So they've lived it. And I think that's valuable, because what you see with the Iranian population is, having gone through it, they're coming out of it now rejecting it, knowing exactly what it means. For them, it's no longer an ideal. For some of the Egyptians, the Syrians, the Libyans, some of the Tunisians, it's a dream to live in a Sharia state. For the Iranians, it's not. They know exactly what kind of a nightmare it is. And so the Iranians I talk to in the diaspora, in Europe and in America, will share that experience. And a lot of them regret and say, we didn't know what it meant. As I think that most Egyptians today really do not know. And Iran has that valuable experience. In the case of Pakistan and Somalia, it's different. These countries were countries after decolonization that are, first of all, very young nation states. Somalia was born in 1960. You know all about Pakistan in 1947. There's no long history of a nation state. Communism was experimented in Somalia. A form of liberalism was experimented in Pakistan that didn't take root. And it was easy for the Saudi-inspired, Saudi-financed propaganda to come in and then distribute the idea that Sharia is the answer. And even Sharia comes to both countries in a very chaotic fashion, in madrasas or indoctrination centers, where young people learn only from the Quran and almost nothing else. And so these countries are faced with, I think, a greater devastation than a country like Iran, that when a formula like Sharia fails, can fall back on what was there before. And I think the same also applies to Turkey. The Turkish religious Islamist side do appeal, and I don't know how much Saudi Arabia is to blame for that. I think the Turkish experience is much more homegrown, even though there is a Saudi influence. But if Islamism fails in Turkey, Turkey will have something else to fall back on. Pakistan doesn't have that. Somalia doesn't have that. Many countries that have been devastated by dictators don't have that.
Do you think it is possible for the West to coexist with the Islamic world? The recent survey that came out just last week about Canadians, the majority felt that there was a sharp chasm that cannot be bridged.
I think that depends on the Muslim experience. We're watching the Arab Spring unfold, spring/what might become a winter. I think that if Muslims go, I'm talking about Muslims who in freedom choose to go with Sharia. If they go through the same experience as the Iranians and they find for themselves that Sharia law, jihadism, the hatred of Jews, that these elements which are in the Muslim Brotherhood discourse or in the Islamist discourse, that discourse does not solve economic problems. It does not create social cohesion. You exchange one form of oppression for another. Once they get that experience, I hope that there's going to be a peaceful coexistence, not only with the West, but with Muslims among themselves. Because if you look at that map of conflict that Avi showed us, most of those conflicts we saw were Muslims against Muslims, Muslims against Hindus, Muslims against Chinese. Everywhere where Muslim majority countries have borders, there is conflict, bloody conflict. And so I think once we get through that experience, there is hope that things might change. Before that, as long as the jihadi narrative continues, where young boys are brought up with a warrior mentality, and we're dying for the sake of Allah to become a shaheed or a martyr, is more of a priority for parents than sending their children to college. As long as that is the case, then we're not going to see any peaceful coexistence between Muslims with Muslims or Muslims with others.
Why do you think Somalis or Pakistanis who have such little interaction with Jews, why is there such Jew hatred in these societies, less in fact than the Arab world?
It has, I was brought up that way. I used to hate Jews without knowing who Jews were, without having ever met any Jewish person. I write about that in Infidel. The first time I asked myself, when did I ever see a Jew to have these incredibly strong feelings of hatred, to endorse their killing, to see them as monsters, to see them as the cause of virtually every problem imaginable to humanity? It's a narrative we grow up with. And it is something like, it becomes the national myth, it's the family myth, it's the community myth. It's tragic, but watching all these negotiations for peace between Israel and Palestine, I look at the Palestinian or the Arab side, and I think, so there is one party where the leadership, the middle groups, the poor people, all have been taught this is evil. And unless we confront that, there's going to be no peace between Israel and Arabs or Israel of any kind of Muslims. Where does it come from? Originally, that is a very long story. Anti-Semitism has been there for a very long time. It preceded Islam. I think there have been all kinds of influences from non-Islamic sources. It's worth mentioning that it has become rampant in Muslim countries, also with Saudi money. And hatred of Jews is not spread by a fringe group who are fanatics and religious. It is spread with state money. If you look at all of these Arab countries that are falling apart now, and I'm talking about the dictatorships, they had different methods of holding to power. But the most prominent was this propaganda they created against the state of Israel. And so if it is in your education system, if it is state-imposed, and it's also bottom-up, coming from any kind of, look at in the Arab Islamic world, look at any kind of opposition to the local dictator. It's not only about political and local grievances, it's also about the state of Israel and about Jews. And because it's this deep and because it is multi-generational, it's going to take a very, very long time. And I think it should be addressed head-on. What the Simon Wiesenthal Institute is doing in Canada should be done worldwide. It should be done, it's an education to over 1.5 billion people that need to know and understand and learn that Jews are fellow human beings.
I grew up as a child in a Catholic school, and what struck me was it was the Catholics who were anti-Jewish in Pakistan in the 50s, and it was quite odd for us to be, because the Jew was the foreigner, but was one, the word Yehudi was one of respect, and it changed in the 70s with the oil boom. Once Islam got out of hand from Egypt or Iran into the hands of the Saudis, everything changed. But it's a long, sordid story. I want to come back to Canada, and our Prime Minister recently said something that was so refreshing for me. I don't know about others. I couldn't believe it. I was watching it on TV, and he was talking to one of our leading television anchors over here, sitting across. And in the midst of the sentence, he said that the main threat to our security comes from what he said, Islamicism. I thought he should have said Islamism. And he mentioned it with very comfort. Two reactions were quite unique. A number of Islamic organizations literally exploded and wanted an apology, including some folks who have wanted the Prime Minister to apologize. On the other hand, the Muslim Canadian Congress I'm not formally part of it, but they welcomed and said, for once, a Western leader has had the courage or the understanding to clearly mention this. Why do you think the people like CARE, who are US-based, or ISNA, which is also US-based, reacted with this anger at the Prime Minister condemning Islamism?
Well, organizations like CARE and ISNA are Islamist organizations. And Islamist organizations in Muslim countries were able to spread their version of Islam by being underestimated and by pretending that they were spreading a discourse that was mainstream, that was acceptable to everyone else, and that they represent all Muslims. They speak for all Muslims. They assume this position. They do the same in Canada, and they do the same in the United States. So when a leader like the Prime Minister stands up to and voices his concerns about radical Islam, they jump forward and try and muzzle such...
But he said Islamism. He didn't say radical Islam.
Well,
this is very significant.
It is significant, and it reveals to those who want to see and those who want to hear what the agenda is of CARE and what the agenda is of Islam. If the Prime Minister had said all Islam and they had responded as they did, all right. But by responding the way they did, I think that calls for a debate on what exactly is the agenda that CARE is pursuing. What exactly is the agenda that ISNA is pursuing? But instead, you'll see that most people will go on the defensive, and then you start having debates about apologies, and then the story dies down. And that has its effect because the next set of leaders will try and avoid that subject because it's volatile. Where the Muslims who have adopted the ISNA CARE Islamist mentality are an elective force, politicians will entirely refrain from the whole Islamist debate. In the Netherlands, when I was a politician, and it became very clear that my party would lose elections in the 4 major cities of the Netherlands, because I voiced, but also members of my party, just like your Prime Minister, were able to say, well, we have to confront this problem of jihad. We lost the elections. Our party leaders responded by saying, well, as of now, we shall use the words extremism, violent extremism. We'll use anything, but we'll edit out Islam, Islamism, jihad, all of that. Now, in the Netherlands, the reaction has been the rise of the party of Geert Wilders. So in a democracy, when you silence one group, another group will rise, but it just tells you, the dynamics of this problem. So if the Prime Minister takes his words back, then I think it is a victory for CARE, it's a victory for ISNA, it's a victory for Islamism, but also it is a victory for marginal groups who will come out and then claim the legitimacy to be able to talk about that big problem that we are having.
Do you feel that there will be a time when Barack Obama would ever use those words?
Well, he's got only 1 more year before election, so... I mean, yeah, there's not that much time left. And I think Barack Obama at the moment has to worry more about the economy and the effects of the economy on his presidency than about this topic. But if national security becomes an issue again, and you never know with, there's the ground zero conflict, and these things come up and go. I think he will have a record where he's been very shy about this. And it was easy because it's not just Barack Obama. It is the liberal establishment feel that the more you accommodate, the more you give in, the less problems you will have with the Islamists. And that's always been, throughout the history of Islamists, that has always been it's been a fatal mistake.
I mean, yesterday's election in New York, where the Republicans won Congressman Anthony Weiner's seat after 1923,
Yes.
the first time, should open his eyes. But anyway, America is a strange animal that I've never been able to understand.
It's a great strange animal.
Well, you've taken our Ingrid Mattison and made her open the Democratic Party convention with an Islamic prayer. Who would have believed it? Who would have believed that the White House would be home to Dalia Mujahid, to Rashad Hassan, to known Islamists who write speeches for the president, and forget about the liberal establishment, the conservative establishment doesn't know these people work there.
Well, I just think, I'm convinced America
Or you have to go back.
the greatest nation, and also what some of the Americans say, after they try all the bad options, Americans will always come with the right option. So let's be hopeful.
Tell me, is it, when you interact with American Muslims or European Muslims, do you not find that, or have you ever explained or asked them why Muslims are the prime victims of Islamism? Why don't they become the main force against it? If you ask them, what do they say?
Well, I try and answer that. It's a great challenge, and I try and answer that question in Nomad. And part of it lies with the fact that if you grow up, so not Islamist, just a mainstream Muslim, believing, not political in the least, but all Muslims are brought up not to question the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad. He was immaculate, all you do is follow. They're also brought up to believe that what is in the Quran is the true word of God. So you're also taught not to question. Now you already come, whether you read the Quran or not, whether you know what Muhammad said or not, you come fully programmed that no criticism is allowed of the two. And even if you have a thought that you may disagree with what you've read in the Quran or what Muhammad said, you feel about yourself incredibly sinful and awful. That, I think, is a great starting point for any Islamist propagandist. Because as a propagandist, you come in and you start with the Quran, and here you have people who are already positively programmed. You talk about the Prophet Muhammad, and that, I think, is one of the reasons why Islamists are very effective in their propaganda. Because well-thinking Muslims who have common sense, who pose the question and say, but, are always silenced with a quote from Allah or from the Prophet Muhammad. And so one of the ways that I explore in doing it is to teach or to introduce or to nudge individual Muslims to think for themselves and to think critically, or otherwise become the victims of a man who puts on a beard and a turban and says, I know, I'll interpret for you what God said. And Muslims then don't realize that that individual is putting himself on God's chair.
But if you go to even the 9th or 10th century, the great debates of rejection of God, you know, la ilaha, there is no God. And these Sufis would say, I'm stopping midway.
Yes.
You know, because the Muslim oath is there is no God but God, and Muhammad is messenger. So these great scholars of the Mutazilite era in Iran and Central Asia, or even India, would say, yes, there is no God, and they'd stop at that. That was 1,000 years ago. Today, I would have hoped that more people would be doing that. What happened? In your view, how did a society that challenged the existence of God, that proclaimed being Muslim by saying, I am God, as in Mansour Halaj's case, where did it go wrong? I think Bernard Lewis answers that question, but from your viewpoint.
I mean, it went wrong. There's so many factors that combine to explain that question properly. But in my experience, there's this lack of criticism combined with the lack of proper education. If you look at the countries the less freedom that there is, the more that a society is in the hands of a dictatorship, the more that the youth is subject to propaganda. And part of the Arab Muslim propaganda, and especially for those dictators, was to use religion as a tool to oppress, to rule, to divide and rule. And unfortunately, the opposition also uses religion as a tool to promise a better government and a better time. And in both cases, the casualty is the critical faculty of the individual to think for himself or for herself. That is what I'm a product of that upbringing. I'm a product of those societies. So I can talk to you about that, that you have to submit, you have to obey, you have to believe. To question is sinful, it is rebellious. To seek answers to your own questions is following the path of the Jews and of Satan. That's where I come from. So I see that as the part of the explanation, but there are also better historical explanations for that. Having said all that, there are still individuals like you and me and other individuals who are, who you haven't heard of, who are not famous, who haven't been published, who still miraculously get out of that context and do ask questions, even though they're born into Islam and struggle with it genuinely. So there is an opportunity to fight that blanket darkness that countries like Saudi Arabia submerge people into just because they were born into Islam.
In the video that we all saw, you had one exchange with a gentleman who I feel is very dangerous, but most Western societies are enamored by him, and that's Tariq Ramadan. Very few people in the West know that he is the son of Said Ramadan, who was a CIA operative established in Switzerland to run hit squads to eliminate nationalist, left-wing or secular liberal Muslims around the Muslim world. He is today, and I noticed how he was not just being rude, he was being dismissive of you in that exchange. How do you explain his acceptance in such large gatherings, like in Montreal? We just had thousands of people coming to listen to him. What is his magic?
It's not his magic. There are more. There's Keith Allison, whom you just mentioned.
Oh yes, a very dangerous man.
The whole ISNA and CARE establishments. We live, the West, as I have come to find out in the last 20 years, these are trust societies. People believe you, they take your word for what you say. If I say, I'm a liberal Muslim, and I want to live at peace with the West and with modernity, if I tell you that, you accept that. Until I've demonstrated over and over and over again that that's not the case. In Islamic societies, they're distrust societies. It's not so much what you say as what you do. Everybody has a hidden agenda. There's no freedom, and that is one way of surviving. And I think with Tariq Ramadan, he's been in the public debate on Islam in the West for some time now, and there is a public record. And there are individuals who follow him closely, like Paul Berman, like Caroline Forest in France. I'm sure there are some Canadians who are onto him. So there are people who go past the charm and the good looks and the Western dress to say, but wait a minute, in this context you say this, in that context you say that. What do you mean?
But he fooled Dalai Lama. Of all the people, the Dalai Lama came to endorse the Organization of Islamic Countries' Islamic Charter of Rights.
Yes, I see that, and it's not just the Dalai Lama, but I think the way I see people, there are some people who want to be fooled. I talk to my liberal friends all the time, and they want to be fooled. They just wish that this problem would go away. And they believe any charlatan who comes along and says, oh, but there's actually no problem between Islam and the West. It's all a misunderstanding. It is white racism. It's Jewish intolerance. If only the Palestinian-Israeli question would be solved, then Pakistan and Afghanistan would be great places. You just see no connection. But there's this deep desire within the West, in free societies, for people to want to be fooled. And Islamists are opportunists. They take advantage of that.
So the two characters, Deepak Chopra and Dalai Lama, get fooled. There isn't much hope left. How the hell does the Dalai Lama have white liberal guilt? I mean...
Yeah. You know...
Anthony Weiner, I can understand.
But the Dalai Lama...
You know
yeah.
what?
Yeah. I'm not a pacifist. And, you know, people who say that only pacifism is the answer to human conflict, like the Dalai Lama, I think they already sign onto an occupation of wanting to be fooled. So I have a great deal of respect for the Dalai Lama, but I think
I'm annoyed. I don't have respect for anyone who says that women at the back of the mosque is cute. Like Alexa McDonough, after 9/11, the leader of a left-wing party, after 9/11 went to a mosque and the imam hit her on her feet because the toes were showing. You guess who said, "I'm sorry"? She said, "I'm sorry."
Oh, I've been in debates all over the place where Muslim women stand up in the audience and attack me and say it's not in the Quran that women should be beaten, and then I give them the verse, chapter 4, verse 34, and then they switch from it's not in the Quran to, okay, he said with a small stick. I mean, talk about human beings wanting to be fooled.
You've been in Europe
Yeah.
as an elected official. Why aren't you keeping your eyes on the Congress, or do you have any ambitions to run? It would be amazing to see congresswomen. Oh my God.
I'm not even a citizen of America.
No, we'll manage that, don't worry.
Yeah, I think that there are different ways of passing my message on, and the way politics is just one of those means. But what I do now by writing, by taking, talking, because what does a politician do? You are in office and you are part of the legislature, but ultimately you have to go to your constituencies and talk to people and talk to people.
But don't you miss Parliament?
And I enjoy that much more than, getting into that intrigue of politics.
Come on, get back to Congress, we'll have fun. But do you find a difference in the political environment between Europe and United States?
I find the two, both places are democratic and they have their democratic histories, but I see a big difference, and I find the United States much more pronounced, both Democrats and Republicans and everything in between, much more pronounced in these issues than in Europe. In Europe, there's virtually no right-wing media. That makes almost all the media one-sided. Now, it doesn't mean that I agree with everything that right-wing people voice, but it would be great to have that balance. In the US, there is some of that balance, and there's more voice given to ideas that are not in the mainstream, or even the mainstream itself is divided. And I think in that sense, the American model is, for me, a more attractive model when debating these issues. Even though the White House at the moment says, let's not mention Islam, etc., let's appease, still, in America, it's, in my experience, the past 4 or 5 years, I've never had any trouble discussing the issue of Islam, women in Islam, the clash of civilizations any of these topics that as a politician in Holland were just simply taboo. You couldn't mention these subjects in Germany without having these huge disclaimers about people being peaceful and so on. Your speaking time would be finished by the time you got to the point.
I think I've had enough questions for you today, but we can go on with people in the audience. If you had any questions, please raise your. Please stand up.
And have access to knowledge, and they're with a whole range of other children, a whole range of other people at the higher levels of education, and exposed to much more. Why is it now that we're almost seeing an Arab Spring in Europe? You're seeing uprisings of a lot of young Muslims. So how do you reconcile that if they do in fact have access to
Education.
modern education?
Well, that's in fact a very, very good question. Why do Muslims who are educated in the West, why do they still entertain the stereotypes and the intolerance that we've seen reported by Avi today? Part of it, and I think I should have been more accurate, and all of us who talk about education should be more accurate in this, is what type of education are we talking about? In Europe, there are Islamist groups like ISNA and CARE, and because almost everything goes through government, some of the government institutions that are responsible for education have come to accept that when it comes to Muslim minorities, certain subjects should be avoided because they are deemed offensive to the audience. For instance, some of the Islamists in Holland have campaigned for the teaching of the Holocaust in some of the schools to be rewarded. It started out that way at first, and then later dropped. And in some schools, it's up to the students to choose. If you want to take Holocaust classes, you do. If you don't, you don't. And most Muslim students, when they go home, they are confronted with this propaganda that the Jews are evil and so on. So when you go to school, don't believe in that Holocaust bullshit. It's them again doing it. So with that kind of, and in France, I mean, it's not just the Holocaust, it is the philosophers, Voltaire in some schools. It was a debate about whether to teach Voltaire or not. In the UK, they're even more accommodating. I'm not talking about Muslim schools, I'm just talking about mainstream education. I remember in the Netherlands discussions of opening theology to Islam. So there's Christian theology, and they thought, well, we have to offer also Muslim theology, where imams were invited. And instead of going to a theology class, you went to a worship class. That is something. If Christians or Jews in the University of Leiden were to propose worship classes during theology, it would be considered complete madness. But with the Muslim lobby, the Muslim push, that was accepted. So there is an opportunity to educate, but those in charge of education have either been duped or persuaded not to. And so I think part of the reason why Europe and European Muslims are more susceptible to the indoctrination, unlike Pakistan and Somalia and the places we are talking about, but this is education in universities, high schools, textbooks being manipulated, the media being manipulated. That has become all very much politicized, and it has become, you can call it multiculturalism, you can call it whatever you like, but it has become an article of good faith and good standing and a noble attitude to give Muslim so-called education leaders the opportunity to exclude Muslim students from proper modern education and from proper critical thinking.
Go ahead.
You've been discussing Islam like a monolithic religion, and I just want to clarify this process. Because when you say talk about Christianity, there's a lot of space between something like the Western Baptist Church and mainstream Baptists who accuse if you point to something Western, then point to let's say that's not what you think. And you can just use your
Nobody can hear you, sorry. You have to be loud. And come to the question, that might help.
There are different sects within
Islam.
There are 12 people who believe in the 12th Imam. Within Shia Muslim, there are Wahhabis. In Canada, we have well-integrated Islami Muslim communities. So, do you think it would be helpful to say within your, identifying extremist Islamists, are there particular elements within Islam that are more prone to that, and should we be engaging the integrated elements of Islam, Muslims, to really work towards combating that?
Well, the question is, we're discussing Islam as if it's a monolith. There is a lot of variety and diversity within Islam, pretty much like Christianity and Judaism. Wouldn't it be helpful if we not only talked about, say, moderate liberal Muslims, but also engaged them? First, I want to correct you by saying we have not been discussing Islam as a monolith. We've been talking about individuals like the gentleman here, Tariq Fatah, like Zuhdi Jasser, all those individuals within Islam who stand up and say they are going to interpret their faith in their own individual way, with a lot of danger to them and a lot of suffering that they pay for that. So if I made the impression on you that Muslim individuals are a monolith, then I take that back. On the other hand, if you look at established Islam as a narrative, whether it is the 12 Imam Shiites, whether it is even the Sufis, Baha'is, you name it, you'll see that there is one common line that goes through all. And that common line is hardly ever discussed, but I find it to be very disturbing in the sense that children are brought up with the fact that the contents of the Quran can never be questioned. And look at my Jewish friends. I've been to a Passover where in a Jewish family, one of the sons said, well, if Moses, they were talking about crossing, the sea was parted for them. And this guy asked, well, why did God first have us persecuted and then later part the sea? He's sadistic. That kind of a discussion at a Muslim dining table, I think, for almost all Muslims is impossible. You don't question why God first says this, then that. Why the Prophet Muhammad, if he was so great for women, did he, endorse polygamy, unlawful, all this unfair treatment of men and women? I would like to see that kind of discussion within Islam, and in that sense, it is a monolith. But there is a great deal of variety. If you are in Turkey, you have a different experience from being in Somalia. If you are a Canadian Muslim, brought up by liberal parents who give you all the education and the freedom in the world as a woman, your experience is going to be very different from the family that covers you up, ties you down, forces you into marriage, and threatens you with honor killings. That variety is there. The next, and I get the monolith question, that's why I'm taking my time about it, is if you talk in terms of scale, what you see is that the number of Muslims who reconcile themselves with modernity, who are progressive, who are like Tariq Fatah, are a minority. And almost all of them are famous. Almost all of them live under threats. That makes it, and that is, I think, why we're having this debate at all. How do we create a majority that is tolerant and marginalize the intolerant. And that is going to take not only decades, but maybe longer.
Can I ask a supplementary to that?
Yeah.
In Bangladesh, we had an election, and the Islamists won 2 seats, and the secularists won 298. In Indonesia, the Nahdlatul Ulama and the Muhammadiyah, the world's largest Muslim organizations, have officially come out for separation of religion and state. So I know what you're saying, but wherever there has been an election, Muslims don't vote for Islamists. Outside the Arab world, I'm talking.
Yes.
If you go to Iran, Turkey, even the Turkish Islamists have to say that they're secularists to win. It's only within the Arab world that the Islamists have legitimacy. Everywhere else, they're a mockery. If in 60s Somalia, nobody could have imagined that women would be wearing these clothes that they wear in downtown Toronto today.
Yeah.
So, but anyway, that's digressing.
Well, but then I would say that that would not make me, actually it would make me less complacent, in the sense that it depends on the amount of success and how rooted the Islamist parties and movements are in a certain country. In Turkey in the 1960s and 70s, it was unfathomable that an Islamist government would be in place. So they did proceed. Exactly as you say, even in the 1980s, 1990s in Somalia, it was unthinkable. All the women would have their colorful dirahs and things. But now when I look at pictures from Somalia, I'm shocked to see women covered as they are and men with beards and all the Islamism that's going on. So I think it's very dangerous to be complacent about small-scale Islamist activism in a society. I would find that much more alarming. And I think in places like Indonesia, Malaysia, you know, to a certain degree, Turkey, I would be far more nervous about what could happen 10 years from now, 20 years from now, than the fact that, you know, the next election or the last election, in the last election, the Islamists failed. They're very persistent, they're very opportunistic, and they get what they want. Look at the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt.
Go ahead, sir.
It seems to me that anti-Semitism is certainly on the rise, and the Islamists are becoming more empowered. In the next 25 years, do you see any real reason for optimism? If so, why?
I was excited, and still I'm very excited about the so-called Arab Spring. I think on the short term, it's going to be an explosion of anti-Semitism. The state of Israel is going to face its worst days in the coming years. But I'm optimistic because the excuse that these are autocratic regimes, and it wasn't just an excuse, it was reality. The reality that autocratic regimes would feed the next generation with that anti-Semitic hatred, that is now going to be challenged. And if, whether they're Islamists or secular, Arab people now get the opportunity to have democracies, to have their own elections and vote for their own governments, the whole narrative that they are victims of external forces is going to collapse. And so in a sense, it is going to take time, but I think we should be optimistic about that. As outsiders, Canadians, Americans, even Israelis, what should we do? I say we should empower those secular liberal voices on the ground, some of whom initiated these demonstrations and these uprisings, but are under-resourced, that are inexperienced, that lack institutions, and that find themselves that their own revolutions is hijacked by the Islamists. Because the Islamists have this common narrative, they have the institutions, they have the resources and all of that. But the idea is not to give up, but it is to go on empowering the secular people and to provide an alternative narrative.
Go ahead, sir.
Thank you.
Certainly hope your analysis is correct, although I quite share your optimism. But my question to you is personal. You're a woman of extraordinary intelligence and insight. In addition to that, you have heroic courage. Not only have you broken with
Louder.
I said you're a woman of extraordinary courage. Not only have you broken with your religion, but you have embraced a point of view that is supremely unpopular and unfashionable in the elite circles of the Western world. Where do you find this?
Where do you find this courage? Oh, I think if you ever stand up to your own father and you tell him, I'm not going to pray, I don't believe in God. Once you pass that threshold, you know, you
The
get,
rest is khalas.
I don't want to say the rest is, but it is, you know, I lived a lie for such a long time. And then I got out of that lie, and it took a great deal to get there. And after that, you'll never give in to another lie. I couldn't leave the lie of pretending to be a Muslim and then adopt or embrace the lie of going along with the mainstream. I wouldn't enjoy the fruits that come out of that. So I don't know if, what I'm saying is not that I know the truth. I'm just saying I find it peaceful and liberating and wonderful to be able to look at myself in the mirror and tell myself the truth. Yeah.
You mentioned the word multiculturalism and the word lie just in the last few minutes. And my friend has written a book called A Delectable Lie about multiculturalism. And I find one of the most terrible things about the West these days is white guilt. People seem offended on my behalf, on your behalf,
Yeah.
on Tarek's behalf. How do we get to the West to re-establish the values that they should be proud of themselves?
I think, did everyone hear the question? The question is about white guilt. The gentleman here in front says he talked about a book written on multiculturalism, and he gets confronted by white people who feel guilty on behalf of him and me and Tarek. And I think the only way to do it is to just state it openly and say, don't treat me like a victim and don't feel guilty on my behalf. And I did that when I moved from the Labour Party to the Liberal Party. I don't know who was more shocked or horrified that a black woman who was supposed to be the ultimate victim forever had made her own decision to move to whatever party she chose. And it was very disconcerting for me to think, I thought these people respected me and they respected my work, to then face these condescending talks about, you don't really know what's good for you, and tell them, no, I know what's good for you, better than you know what's good for me. And I think if you have conversations like that, and also to say it is, white guilt is a form of racism. It is sugary, I mean, it's coated in all kinds of wonderful intentions, but it is racist, deeply racist. It assumes a position of superiority. Don't feel guilty on my behalf. I am responsible for my own destiny. If you refuse to excuse misogyny from a white man or anti-Semitism from a white German family, then you must equally condemn misogyny from a black man or a brown man or any kind of family. If you don't do that within yourself and you find yourself making excuses for that, then there's something wrong with you, not me. And I think that's the big challenge that multiculturalism poses. And you know, this putting
I think I've labeled it as the racism of lowered expectations,
Yeah.
where people think that these dark-skinned Muslims really don't know. They're not really human yet.
Yeah.
So we got to take care of them. So if they start thinking, then what do we do? Because we have to go out there and liberate them.
Yes, or if we start a conversation about their religion, they might erupt in violence because they really don't know how to handle these things.
And we're
That is-
exotic. Well, you have to admit, we're exotic, you know. You know, it's like circus clowns. People pay tickets and we entertain them.
Yeah.
So anyway,
Yeah.
not to worry.
Yeah.
Please.
Tarek, I wonder if you might, I thought I heard you say Obama has 3 Islamist speechwriters.
Yes.
Did I hear that correctly? I wonder if you might elaborate on that. Maybe share with the audience what you told me earlier about the phenomenon of that 15-minute speech and how it's circulated around the world.
Well, what happened, I know President Obama since he was the Illinois senator, and there's one circle of friendship that we have a common friend. And during the election campaign, he was advised that all his secular Muslim friends who wined with him or sometimes dabbled in bacon or gambling or even dated, dare I say, were to be excluded from his circle because he had no religious Muslim friends. All his friends were Indian, Pakistani, Muslims and Hindus. The man was secular. I know of one personal incident, where he was traveling with a Pakistani friend who was talking about the Jewish conspiracies, and Barack Obama stopped the car and asked him to get out. He said, I don't like sitting next to anti-Semites. This is before he became a senator. And this close friend was telling me what a fair man he was. What happened as a result of appointing a former IDF soldier as his chief of staff, some people with tremendous wisdom said, you have to compensate that, with Rahm Emanuel has to be now compensated with Muslims who are not good looking, who have to be ugly enough to be considered authentic Muslims. So search parties went out. All his secular liberal Muslim friends were told, you're out in the first term. In the second term, you might come back in the circle. No telephone conversations, nothing whatsoever. He has been to Pakistan a number of times when he was known as Barry. And he has a large circle of friends from India and Pakistan. They were asked to be out. And I'm saying that on first person communications from the friend who was told, you stay out. And they started looking for bearded and women with head covers. And they found this great Canadian Islamist, Ingrid Mattison, who became president of the Islamic Society of North America, who, by the way, is married to an Egyptian jihadi, who, by the way, was a representative of the Mujahideen at the United Nations.
Wow.
She became the person to open the Democratic Party Congress convention, where Barack Obama was the nominee. She came with her nun-like appearance, is from Kingston, and she is the quintessential good Muslim because she's white, she speaks fluent English, and she's a hijabi. Next was the Egyptian-born Dalia Mujahid,
Oh, yeah.
who, by the way, Gallup, the organization Gallup in the Middle East and in South Asia is in the hands of the Islamists. In Pakistan, it is led by a member of the Jamaat-e-Islami, Ijaz Shafi Gilani. She works out of Abu Dhabi, the Gallup organization over there, and she joins this circle he establishes that sent him to Egypt, not to Indonesia. When he had to speak to the Muslim world, the Indonesians were begging, come to where you grew up. And there would have been millions on the street to greet him. These guys managed to send him to Egypt, where he said, no one from the government should be there, but the Muslim Brotherhood has to sit in the front row. That was Dalia Mujahid. Nobody pays attention because you folks can't pronounce these names. I'm serious. If it was Lenin or Hitler, you know, the guy wears a suit, he listens to Wagner, fine. Rashad Hassan, the man who defended Sami al-Aryan, the Florida professor who admitted to terror charges, that man got appointed as the American ambassador to the 52-nation organization of Islamic countries. Do you know that? You don't know that. Do you know Professor Harthi, who's been appointed to the circle. I can go on and on. In the Homeland Security Department, the top lawyer today is a Syrian American, Khalid al-Shura. You don't know that. He spoke in Ottawa to a group of council that meets with CSIS and RCMP when he was challenged by the now president of the Muslim Canadian Congress, Salma Siddiqui, that why are you defending ISNA and informing CSIS and RCMP that it's a liberal organization? Next week she found she ended up on no-fly list.
Oh, that's why I'm on a no-fly list.
This is just the icing. The problem why we are having this crisis is because east of the Urals and south of the Mediterranean, the names are not pronounceable. And therefore you hire outside consultants to tell us, brother, what's happening in Afghanistan. Because we only go there for tours of duty. Don't go there to fight wars. I'm sorry, I'm digressing. But these people are there, there are lots more. And that is one reason why, as an Obama supporter, I hope he loses. I'm just terrified at the people wanting to replace him, like Bachmann and... anyway, I don't want to go there. Sorry, the gentleman has a question.
I think I speak on behalf of everybody here that we're huge fans of yours.
Thank you.
Yours too.
Oh, thank you.
But as a Jew in Canada, my fear is that this is something that we can talk about and we can debate about, but at the end of the day, this is a problem that Islamism, Islamofascism, is something that needs to be fought. And if I, as a Canadian Jew, speak out about it, I can be misconstrued as an Islamophobe. Is this not something that's more a job for Muslims to take on internally, and where is the courage of more people like you?
Islamophobia is it's a propaganda term, it's a PR term. It's been cultivated and it's been a successful brand to brand people who, you know, in this debate take the position that Tariq and I take and many others. You as a Canadian Jew or as a Canadian Christian, as a Westerner, I think you are part of that debate. You became part of that debate from the time you became targets. And not individual targets, but you know, this blanket target of all Jews, of Westerners, of the whole of America. So you can't get out of it, whether you like it or not. You have more of an interest to do something about it than Muslims do. And your interest is more urgent. Because if Islamists get what they want, they'll come for you first. I'm sorry that I hate to put it in this radical way, but that's the way I see it. So Islamophobia is just a PR, it's a method of silencing you. The thing to do is to invite a counter brand, a different way of showing, no, we have a problem and we need to talk about it and we need to keep talking about it. And if we get elect presidents who do not want to talk about it, then we need to vote them out of office.
I'll just add my take on this. Islamism and Islamofascism's main victims are Muslims. If you have about 10,000 North Americans, 5,000 North Americans who have died in the last 10 years, there are 50,000 Pakistanis who've died.
Yeah.
There is countless, tens of thousands of Somalis who have been butchered by the Al-Shabaab. It goes on and on. Every day Iran hangs at least one Muslim. The Kurdish right of self-determination is crushed by 4 Muslim countries: Turkey, Iraq, Iran, and Syria. Western Sahara, which is 100% Muslim, is occupied by Morocco. Aceh, which is a 500-year-old Muslim civilization, is occupied by Indonesia. This goes on and on. Mecca and Medina, Islam's holiest cities, are occupied. The country is known as Hijaz, is occupied by the Saudi family. So we are paying the price. The message has just come to you. And I'll tell you where you can play a role. Who do you think supported Sharia law in Canada? The Canadian Jewish Congress. Who do you think today is supporting a mosque in a public school in Don Valley West? The Jewish organizations. Who do you think in New York City is supporting the mosque at Ground Zero, which is the middle finger to all of America? I'll give you the list of rabbis who come forward and say, you are Islamophobes. I'm telling you, the crisis is that Western liberalism and intelligentsia has destroyed the will of Muslims to rise up and get their own reformation. And I'll tell you one last thing. You all know about Irshad Manji. Today she was there in the US Congress introducing the most wicked man possible, the most hostile anti-Israeli politician in America, and that's Keith Ellison. She stood up and was paid glowing tributes to the great Congressman Keith Ellison. Why? Because we are not thinking of this as war. We're thinking of this as entertainment. This is war. Mine and your lives and our children's lives depend on it. This woman should never have been hunted down and chased. Whether she is an atheist, a Muslim, a Jew, or a Christian, she is our Joan of Arc. And she was abandoned by people who I don't wish to name because they value what is the return on investment in banking on this person or that person. Thank God the present intelligentsia was not there to run the West when we were at war with Hitler. Should we take two more questions? Okay, one last question from a woman, please. Oh, please. Yeah. Yes.
Did you all hear the question? The question is, here's a Dutch-Canadian woman who knows Holland as a free society, and she'd like to know what to emphasize in that society to fight Islamism. There are many, many things that you can emphasize, but given the short time that we have, that exactly what you said, do you know, as a society, do you bank on an individual who tells you what to hear now in order to win the next election? Or do you face the ugly truth and probably go with an individual who's not as articulate, who doesn't have a large following, but who is telling you this is how things are? Jihad is an enemy narrative. It's insidious. It will come in peace and leave at war. It's better for Dutch society, and I think Canadian society, all of these Western societies, not to be trapped in the appeal of appeasement.
Yes.
The appeal of short-term peace. Short-term peace. And what conflict are we talking about? We're talking about losing an election, or we're talking about a mere confrontation. Whereas in the long term, if you feed that and if you allow it to grow and grow, we're talking about bloody violence. So the one thing to emphasize is face reality, however ugly it is, sooner than later. Yeah.
Well, on behalf of everyone, I'd like to thank you very much for coming to Toronto, to Canada. It's a great place. It's better than the United States of America. I'll tell you, even $1 sometimes gets better than theirs. And we are more colorful. But thank you very much.
You're welcome, Harry. You're welcome. Thank you very much.